one of the great research professors of our time, believe me when I tell you. It's an honor to be in the presence of such a prodigious mind. She's a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and recently ranked third among most influential African-American social work scholars in the United States of America. An associate professor here at the Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, director of the USC Hartford Center of Excellence, and founder and chair of Advocates for do you sleep? African American Elders. I am also proud to call her my friend and colleague, the incomparable Dr. Karen Lincoln, everybody. Hey, you. Well, that's all the time we have, people. By the time I get finished reading all of her accolades, there's nothing your accomplishments. Are you kidding me? This is amazing. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. How you? You're the first one to sit in our Oprah chairs, all right?
Oh, very good.
Right? We just changed the set.
I'll show warm them up.
So you're doing some incredible work. And I know Alzheimer's, for one thing, is really part of the incredible, it's a passion for you, but it's the work that you do. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, why do you think it's affecting ethnic communities, particularly African-American communities, so hard these days?
Well, I think that, so we only have one known cause of Alzheimer's disease, and that's age. Mm-hmm. So the older you are, the higher your risk.
Sure.
So that's the only one that we know about. Mm-hmm. What we think about in terms of risk factors happen to be more prevalent among African Americans. So some risk factors include chronic health diseases like hypertension and diabetes and cardiovascular diseases.
Really?
Yes, and obesity, which are higher among African Americans.
Sure.
Chronic stress.
Yeah.
There's new research that shows that financial strain is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease.
Stress, yeah.
Poverty.
Absolutely.
And so also, sleep deprivation, which we have, African Americans have one of the highest sort of rates of poor sleep quality in the United States. So all of these are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease.
And so the brain, the restorative portion isn't necessarily happening.
Absolutely. During sleep, yes.
During sleep.
Right, and with stress.
So I know, like, when we talk about Alzheimer's and dementia, plaques and tangles that concern themselves with Alzheimer's, and of course the acetylcholine neurotransmitter, there's like a depletion. If we could figure that out, perhaps we'd be racing to the cure?
Potentially. I mean, there's a lot of research going on that's trying to figure out sort of the neuroscientific part of it. I'm more focused on the social aspect because we do know that there are environmental hazards and social hazards. And we don't do a lot of research on place, like where people live and what they're exposed to and their experiences just being, an adult, particularly an African-American adult in America, and how that increases their risk factors for Alzheimer's disease.
This is important. You know what? I think we forget just living in the world can present its own stressors, and particularly if you're a part of an ethnic group that's already riddled with a lot of stressors that, through no fault of your own, are here, and then you're left to have to sort of pick up the pieces. And so that social component has lasting implications into the neurological and into brain functioning.
From birth.
From birth.
From birth.
Really?
Right.
Explain that more.
Well, just in terms of, a baby sort of growing in their mom and what they're exposed to, particularly if they're an African-American woman. So we know with African-American women have the highest rate of infant mortality, and educated African-American women, highly educated African-American women have a higher infant mortality than poor white women, right? Women who have a 9th grade education.
What?
That is true.
What accounts for that socially?
Well, there are a number of theories. Most people sort of target racial discrimination and what African-American women are experiencing, which sort of, affects their birth outcomes.
That's why they can't create teratogens. The interesting thing is now that you're talking, I'm thinking, even in utero, even an educated African-American woman, the health disparities can still exist. Even with the PPO, she could run into some discrimination.
Oh, absolutely.
I get it.
And in your job and in your community, depending on where you're living.
Sure.
So the exposures to certain kinds of racial discrimination might be different for a higher SES, African-American woman than they would be for a low SES, but still,
but no less
there's exposure.
Detrimental.
Oh, absolutely. The effect on the body is still the same.
This groundbreaking research, BrainWorks. I want to make sure I get it right.
Right.
How is it different, and who is it helping?
So one of the reasons that we created BrainWorks is to deal with some of the social issues, right? So for example, we know that health literacy accounts for up to $238 billion
You've got to be
in terms of costs for the U.S. economy.
Really?
Low health literacy. And so in Alzheimer's disease, literacy rates are really low among African Americans, and they do account for some of the higher prevalence rates that we're seeing. So I wanted to focus more on raising the level of Alzheimer's disease education so that we would be able to recognize the symptoms when we saw them, that we would know to get, talk to our doctors about that. We would know to get assessed for that, because one of the things that we're seeing is that on average, when African Americans begin to notice like memory loss, it takes them on average like 7 years before they talk to their doctor about it.
Whoa, and by that time,
There's so much that we could have done that we're unable to do.
Wow.
So BrainWorks is an Alzheimer's disease literacy program that sort of educates African Americans about Alzheimer's disease.
So tell me this, or you probably do this already, but I find myself really wanting to be a part of the community where the churches are. I use this phrase, go where the people already are.
Right.
Because you have an instant audience.
Right.
The idea of going into the churches, into the communities, into the fish fries,
Right.
and wherever they are, the barbershops.
Right.
That's amazing.
That's exactly where we go. And then we bring them to a talk show. So we use a talk show format to provide the education. So it's much like this, right? They get to ask us questions. We have music and food. So it's very culturally relevant. And the words that we use when we're talking about the disease is very accessible, because that's the other thing. We don't use a lot of terminology.
They're not going to get it.
Right. We use things that are relevant and terminology that's relevant. And so people become much more aware of the disease.
Nice. That's great. I mean, I'm glad to hear you've got, music and you got your talk show and all of that. Nobody has called me and invited me, but I love you anyway, and I think it's great work you're doing, and I support you even though you don't support me. Because I'm a Trojan and we're part of the Trojan family, and that's what we do.
And when you become the third most highest ranked African American scholar in social work, I will support you. Thank you very much.
Everybody. Show's over. We're leaving. Show's over. Yeah, I said it first about you. I'm your number one fan. No, this is good. You know what? I think this camaraderie, seriously, I think it encourages our people to not be afraid of our degrees. You understand what I'm saying? Because there's a point where you start to go, and this isn't race specific. This happens in whether it's Jewish communities, white communities, Mexican communities. When you really get a terminal degree, and all of a sudden, how many times do people say to you, well, I ain't got a PhD in nothing, but I mean, I know that. And I'm like, I'm not advertising that I have a terminal degree. So. And
the reality is, despite, joint PhDs and 2 master's degrees, which is what we have.
Next to her, I feel so unsuccessful.
No, but the reality is, but I will tell you that the work that I do and the commitment that I have, and the fact that my mother has dementia, and being in the community every day, you're it's relative, right?
Absolutely.
You're dealing with people and working with people and being educated by your own people.
Absolutely. Yep. That's it. And you know what? But they need to understand, and I think this is just across the board, that people need to understand that I'm a perpetual student. So I'll never stop learning. And I saw when my mother, I talked about earlier very briefly, my mother had cancer and lost her battle. But before she did, you know what chemotherapy can do, to the faculties and the cognitive functioning, et cetera. And so the prefrontal cortex and all that was happening. And so you forget that you're Dr. Gabe Crenshaw. You forget you're Dr. Carol. You're your daughter.
Right.
I'm a son. And you start to see the debilitating things that happens.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And when you see the ravaging effect of Alzheimer's disease on our community,
Isn't it amazing?
The degrees and all of that sort of goes away. You just want to do something, and you have to reach a population that really isn't being addressed. So that's why we created BrainWorks, to sort of help even that playing field, so that we will know that we need to get assessed, that we will know that there is help for us, even though there's no cure.
Right.
There are a lot of things that you can do to protect your family, to protect yourself, and to protect your well-being.
And that, and that's right. That was the question I was going to ask you. What are some of the ways to help avoid, or at least slow down, this process of Alzheimer's?
Right. So one of the most important things that you can do is take care of your health, right? So to prevent or to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease is the same thing that you would do to reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease.
Really?
For obesity. right? For diabetes,
Sure.
for hypertension, it's the same thing. So we need to think about what we're eating. We need to think about exercising as much as we can. And for brain health, we want to think about doing, you know, those crossword puzzles and BrainWorks.
That stuff really works,
right,
huh?
It does. Well, in BrainWorks, we talk about doing crossword puzzles, but because it's targeted for African Americans, we talk about big whist and spades and dominoes.
All right.
And the kinds of things
Take
that
me
are
to Boston,
relevant.
baby.
That's right. That's for our community in terms of these are the kinds of things that you can do to exercise your brain to help reduce your risk.
That's awesome. And so I see how that ties into the whole social dynamic too, because
Right.
those things involve people,
Right.
and where people are
Right.
gathered.
Right.
Right. Even that is a challenge for the brain.
Right.
Even just remembering old times or an old song
Absolutely.
or old history, et cetera. And so
Right.
all of that really sort of triggers that temporal lobe, triggers the hippocampus, and just gets things going.
And social interaction.
Social interaction.
Even
yeah.
just interacting with people, being in social situations helps to reduce your risk.
All right, hit this real quick because this is important. Inside the community versus the scientific research modality. Inside the laboratory versus real life. Talk to us about that, because people in the lay world, they have seemingly no use for research, but we know as a researcher, you need both
Right.
to inform. But it sounds like what you're saying, you also need the community to inform research. Is that true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We do community participatory research. So we take
Say
what
that again.
community participatory research. Like, we can't do what we do with BrainWorks if we did not have the participation and the information and education from the community. So we are able to take what you can sort of produce and create in a lab and translate it to the community, but we can only do that with community support and sort of input, right? So you can create anything in a lab and it might work well, right?
Right.
But once you put it in the community and try to test it on people, that's typically where things go wrong. So we eliminate that sort of disconnect by having people in the community involved from the very beginning so that we know it's translatable.
Fosters trust too, because historically in this country,
absolutely.
let's not kid ourselves,
That's right. That's right.
Right. African Americans have, they've been lab rats, guinea pigs
Right.
for a lot
Right.
of what was supposed to be wonderful research,
Yep.
when in actuality it
We
was
hear
to their
that all the
detriment.
time. We hear that all the time. Oh, still.
That historical implication cannot be overstated.
No, it can't.
And so you're going into the community, it fosters trust. They get a sense of who you are.
Right.
And then trust you too to establish.
Right.
You didn't swap over to the other side,
That's
and now
right.
you're coming back, to infiltrate.
No, we waited 5 years to design BrainWorks because we knew we had to build those relationships, make sure we had community support. So it took us a while to get there, but we knew it was a really important investment, and we became more educated about how to do the work that we're doing, and so it was a win-win for everyone.
I love that.
Unlike some researchers who ask for something first, we didn't ask, we gave. We did a lot of educational forums. We provided, opportunities for us to have conversations to get a sense of what community members wanted. And so we did that.
Talk to me. Can you give me one experience when you first started? You walk in, you're not necessarily Dr. Karen Lincoln. You're walking in and saying, I'm here to listen. I'm here to help.
Well, what's interesting about that is I've always been Dr. Karen Lincoln, because people know who you are before you come.
Okay.
People aren't ignorant to the
Right.
fact that they've invited someone into their presence.
Okay.
So they know who you are.
Did they trust you?
No, of course not. They didn't know me. Then they got to know me.
3 steps. How do you walk into a community, even if it looks like you, but you are in a top tier? And how do you get them to trust you? What 3 steps? What did you do?
Well, the first step is, on my team, I'm the only academic. So everyone who works with me comes from the community. So the first thing that I did to build advocates for African American elders was to go around and talk to people who were working with African American older adults and say, hey, is anyone doing this kind of work? What do you think about it? Is this something that we need?
Wow.
And so once I got the endorsement for those who had been working in the community for 20, 30 years and decided to join with me, that provides some level of legitimation, right? So it was then having those conversations with people who know the community, who've been working in the community, who can legitimize me and endorse me. Wow. Then we began to go out and introduce ourselves as a collective.
Gotcha.
And so she's with them, so she must be cool.
Exactly. And you got to eat with them.
That's right.
With
for
us,
sure.
right?
Absolutely.
Right. And I want to. So this is just great. I mean, all of the incredible work that you have done, are currently doing, it makes us all better. And even though we talk about specific to African Americans, particularly because you're dealing with that, this is not African American specific.
Right.
Right? This affects everybody. And I think that's what's so important, that the work that you're doing, though it's targeted right now in this particular area because there's a need.
Right.
All right, there's a need, but that does not mean that it doesn't have utility for everyone.
That's true.
You're a doctor for everyone.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
awesome.
And I just happen to be addressing a population that has the highest risk and that has the lowest level of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so that's the target.
Absolutely, and that's what education does.
Absolutely.
And that's what social workers are going to do, and that's what this whole program is all about, to create more social workers to do exactly what you do and follow in your footsteps. It'll take them a lifetime to get where you are, but lead the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
She called me by my first name.
I did.
Oh.
Dr. Gabe.
No, call me Gabe. That means you like me. You really like me.
You're going too far now.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen. We appreciate it.